In the absolute darkness of the night of November 30th, 1942, the black waters off Guadalcanal would witness one of the most humiliating defeats of the United States Navy during the entire Second World War. A defeat so devastating that it would be deliberately obscured in American historical records, overshadowed by subsequent victories, buried under layers of more comfortable narratives about heroism in the Pacific. The Americans called it the Rat Run. The Japanese called it the Tokyo Express. Every night, Japanese destroyers sailed down the slot, that waterway between the Solomon Islands, bringing desperately needed supplies to their starving troops on Guadalcanal. And every night, the American Navy tried to stop them. That night, Rear Admiral Carleton Wright commanded a task force of 5 heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers. Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Honolulu, and Northampton, all powerful cruisers, armed to the teeth, accompanied by the destroyers Fletcher, Drayton, Maury, and Perkins. It was a formidable force, or so it appeared on paper. Wright had just taken command. He didn't know those waters. He didn't know the enemy he was about to face. On the other side, descending the slot with the confidence of someone who had run that race dozens of times, came Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka with 8 destroyers. Just 8 destroyers against 5 American cruisers and 4 American destroyers. Tanaka wasn't looking for battle. His mission was simple: deliver supply drums to the troops ashore, but he was one of the most brilliant destroyer commanders Japan had ever produced, and his ships carried something that would change everything that night: the Long Lance torpedoes. Pure oxygen as propellant, leaving no trail of bubbles, traveling at 50 knots for over 20 miles, carrying a warhead of almost half a ton of explosives. The Americans had no idea what was coming their way. American radar detected the Japanese ships at 11:16 p.m. Wright hesitated. He hesitated for 4 precious minutes before giving the order to fire torpedoes. His destroyers launched 20 torpedoes against the Japanese formation, but only one hit, damaging the destroyer Takanami. Then Tanaka counterattacked. Not with cannons, with torpedoes. 44 Long Lance torpedoes were launched into the dark waters, lethal and invisible serpents gliding in deadly silence through the night. The American cruisers opened fire with their guns, illuminating themselves against the night sky, making them perfect targets. And then the torpedoes arrived. The Minneapolis was hit first. A monstrous explosion ripped off its entire bow. More than 40 meters of steel simply vanished. The ship should have sunk right there, but its crew fought desperately, managing to keep it afloat. Seconds later, the New Orleans exploded. Another Long Lance torpedo found its target. The entire bow separated from the hull, more than 45 meters, taking 183 men to the bottom of the ocean. The ship continued moving forward briefly, its decapitated mass gliding through the water before they could reverse the engines. The Pensacola tried to maneuver, but it was too late. A torpedo pierced its hull, flooding its oil compartments, which then caught fire. Gigantic flames consumed the ship, turning it into a floating torch in the middle of the ocean. The Honolulu, by miracle or luck, managed to avoid the torpedoes that passed silently on both sides of its hull. But the Northampton was not so lucky. 2 Long Lance torpedoes struck it on the port side. The explosions ripped open its hull, instantly flooding the engine rooms. The ship began to list dangerously. Its crew fought for 3 hours to save it, pumping water, fighting fires, battling the inevitable. But at 2:50 a.m., the captain gave the order to abandon ship. At 3:04 a.m., the Northampton capsized and sank, taking 58 men with it. In less than 20 minutes, 4 of the 5 American cruisers had been destroyed or severely damaged. The Japanese destroyers disappeared into the darkness, virtually unscathed, completing their mission of delivering supplies before returning through the slot. The cost was brutal. 396 American sailors killed, more than 700 wounded. 4 heavy cruisers out of action for months. The Japanese lost 1 destroyer and fewer than 100 men. It was a devastating tactical victory for Japan, achieved through superior skill, better tactics, and superior weaponry despite being outnumbered. Tanaka had demonstrated that even when outnumbered, experienced commanders with the right equipment could inflict catastrophic damage. But here's the truth that few Americans know. The Battle of Tassafaronga was one of the worst American naval defeats of the war. It was deliberately overshadowed. The official narrative focused on subsequent victories, on battles where America prevailed, on the heroes who emerged from other engagements. Guadalcanal was eventually won, and in that greater victory, Tassafaronga was forgotten, an embarrassing footnote. The Navy learned brutal lessons that night. It learned about the need for better night training, about the lethality of the Japanese torpedoes they had underestimated, about the danger of technological arrogance. It learned that having more ships did not guarantee victory. That radar did not replace combat experience. That hesitation in battle cost lives. Wright was quietly removed from surface command. Tanaka, ironically, was criticized by his superiors for not sinking more ships, for not being aggressive enough, demonstrating the brutal disconnect between Japanese command on land and the realities of combat at sea. The damaged cruisers returned to Pearl Harbor, where their crews recounted stories of torpedoes that left no trace, explosions that seemed to come from nowhere, and ships that simply vanished beneath their bows. It took time for the high command to fully believe in the extent of Japanese torpedo superiority. Tassafaronga remains a grim reminder that even in a war America would win, even in a campaign that would eventually be conquered, there were nights of utter defeat, moments where the enemy's skill completely overcame brute force, where men died not for lack of courage, but for lack of adequate preparation. It's a story of hubris and its price in blood. A story about how war doesn't respect the amount of steel you bring to battle, but rather how you employ it. A story that deserved to be told, not buried. Because only by acknowledging our defeats can we truly honor those who died in them and learn the lessons they paid with their lives to teach us. In the weeks following the battle, as the damaged ships were slowly towed across the Pacific, the true magnitude of the disaster began to be understood. The shipyards at Pearl Harbor were shocked when they saw what had happened. Entire bows simply torn away as if some titanic force had bitten into the steel. Compartments flooded with such violence that the bulkheads had bent like paper. Engineers measured the damage and calculated the force required to cause such destruction, and finally began to understand what they were fighting against. Interrogations of the crews revealed disturbing details. Men swore there were no torpedo trails, no bubble trails visible even under the spotlights during the battle. The torpedoes simply appeared, lethal phantoms materializing against the hulls. Some sailors reported seeing dark shapes passing under their ships seconds before the explosions, but in the total darkness of that night, it was impossible to be certain of anything. The Minneapolis spent 4 months in repairs. Its destroyed bow had to be completely rebuilt. The new section had a slightly different design, making it forever identifiable as a survivor of Tassafaronga. The New Orleans took even longer, returning to service only in August 1943. The Pensacola, burned and torn apart, spent months being reassembled. Each of these ships represented thousands of hours of labor, millions of dollars, and desperately needed combat capability at a critical moment in the war. But the true cost wasn't measured in steel or money. It was measured in men. The survivors carried scars that would never fully heal. Sailors who had been in the forward compartments of the cruisers when the torpedoes struck, those who survived, told stories of comrades simply vanishing in the blast, of water rushing in like a solid wall, of darkness and confusion, and the sheer terror of being trapped in a sinking compartment. The men of the Northampton had to abandon their ship in shark-infested waters in total darkness, not knowing if the Japanese would return to finish the job. They clung to wreckage, to each other, waiting for rescue that seemed never to come. When they were finally picked up, many were in shock, unable to speak, staring blankly into nothingness. And then there were the families. 396 letters were sent to American homes. In the dead of winter in 1942, when America was still adjusting to being at war, when victory seemed distant and uncertain, these families received the news that their sons, husbands, fathers, brothers would not be returning home. Many of them didn't even have bodies to bury, lost at the bottom of the Guadalcanal Strait, in waters now called Iron Bottom Sound because of the number of ships that rest there. The official investigation was discreet, almost silent. There were no dramatic court-martials, no public scapegoats. The Navy knew it desperately needed experienced officers. It couldn't afford to destroy careers over one defeat when there were so many battles still to be fought. But the conclusions were brutal in their private honesty. Wright had hesitated. The training was wrong. The night procedures were inadequate. The torpedo training was insufficient. The intelligence on Japanese capabilities was outdated and dangerously inaccurate. More importantly, the Americans had developed a fatal technological arrogance. They had radar. The Japanese did not. Therefore, they assumed they had an insurmountable advantage in night combat. But the radar of 1942 was primitive, temperamental, and difficult to interpret. And the Japanese had compensated for their lack of radar with years of intensive night training. Superior optics and tactics developed through real combat experience in China and the early Pacific War. The long-lance torpedoes were a technological breakthrough that completely changed tactical calculations. American torpedoes of the time had a range of less than 10,000 yards and traveled at 45 knots. The long lance could hit targets more than 40,000 yards away traveling at 50 knots, or travel slower for even greater distances. This difference was not incremental, it was revolutionary. It meant that the Japanese could launch torpedoes from distances where the Americans couldn't even retaliate, and that these torpedoes would arrive faster than any ship could maneuver to avoid them. Oxygen propulsion was ingenious in its simplicity and lethal in its effectiveness. American torpedoes used compressed air, which left a visible trail of bubbles. Pure oxygen left no trace. In the darkness of a night battle, this was the difference between life and death. American sailors literally couldn't see what was killing them. Tanaka understood this perfectly. He had trained his crews ruthlessly, conducting night drills repeatedly until each man could perform his duties in complete darkness, until torpedo launching was second nature. He had developed tactics specifically designed to maximize the advantages of the long lance, tactics that involved launching large spreads of torpedoes from multiple angles, creating depth fields through which enemy ships would have to navigate. And it worked perfectly at Tassafaronga. The Americans sailed straight into the trap without realizing it. Wright had positioned his cruisers in line, standard formation, maximizing their forward firepower, but also making them perfect targets. When they opened fire with their guns, they lit up like targets on a firing range. Tanaka simply calculated the positions, launched his torpedoes at carefully calculated spreads, and let the deadly mathematics do the rest. The irony was that the Americans could have won. They had more ships, more guns, better radar. If Wright had acted decisively when he first detected the Japanese, if he had launched his torpedoes immediately, if he had ordered a coordinated attack from the destroyers while keeping the cruisers at bay, the outcome could have been completely different. But he hesitated, and in naval warfare, hesitation kills. The Japanese also learned lessons, albeit different ones. Tanaka was severely criticized by the Japanese command not for losing the battle, which he clearly won, but for not being aggressive enough, for not pressing his attack, for not trying to sink all the American ships. This criticism revealed a fundamental disconnect between the command on land and the realities of combat at sea. Tanaka had achieved a remarkable victory against superior force. He had severely damaged 4 cruisers and sunk one while losing only 1 destroyer. But for the Japanese command, obsessed with decisive battles and total annihilation of the enemy, this was not enough. This mentality would cost Japan dearly. Tanaka, one of its most brilliant commanders, would eventually be removed from operational command. His skills wasted in administrative positions because he did not fit the aggressive doctrine that the Japanese command insisted on following. It was a waste of talent that Japan, already stretched to its limit, could not afford. For America, Tassafaronga was a silent turning point. The lessons learned that night were incorporated into new training procedures, new tactics, and a new respect for the enemy's capabilities. Subsequent cruisers were designed with better torpedo protection. Night training was dramatically intensified. New torpedoes were developed, eventually equaling and surpassing the Japanese Long Lance, although this would take time. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. Tassafaronga shattered the illusion of automatic technological superiority. It forced the American Navy to recognize that it was fighting a competent, well-trained, well-equipped, and extremely dangerous enemy. That humility, wrested from blood and steel on that dark November night, saved countless lives in subsequent battles. The following month saw the tide turn on Guadalcanal. The starving and sick Japanese forces were eventually evacuated. The island was secure. The campaign was declared an American victory. And in the narrative of that victory, Tassafaronga was forgotten, buried beneath more comfortable tales of heroism and triumph. But the men who were there never forgot. The survivors carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Some never spoke about that night, the trauma too profound for words. Others told their stories at veterans' reunions, to families, to anyone who would listen, desperate that those who died would not be forgotten. Because that is what Tassafaronga truly represents. Not just a tactical defeat, not just an operational failure, but a reminder that war is chaos, that even the most powerful forces can be defeated, that technology without skill is useless, that hesitation costs lives, and that the price of war is always measured in human blood, not in tons of steel. The ships that survived Tassafaronga returned to the war with their scars reinforced. The Minneapolis, with its bow rebuilt, fought in the Marshall Islands. On Saipan, in the Philippines, bombarding beaches before the amphibious landings, its altered profile a silent testament to that night. The New Orleans participated in the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, its crews ever conscious that they were sailing on a ship that had been literally decapitated and survived. The Pensacola continued serving in the Pacific, every man aboard knowing they had been burned and yet remained afloat. These ships became silent legends, symbols of resilience, but also constant reminders of the price paid. What makes Tassafaronga particularly disturbing in the American narrative of World War II is not just that it was a defeat, but how that defeat was systematically minimized in the public consciousness. When the war ended and historians began writing the official accounts, Guadalcanal was presented as a decisive American victory, the turning point in the Pacific. And it was, in strategic terms. But within this larger narrative of victory, individual battles like Tassafaronga were presented as minor setbacks, tactical incidents that did not affect the final outcome. This approach served a purpose. America needed a coherent victory narrative, a steady progression from defeat at Pearl Harbor to triumph in Tokyo. Embarrassing defeats didn't fit into that story. But the cost of this sanitized narrative was that generations of Americans grew up without fully understanding the brutal and uncertain nature of war, without fully appreciating how much victory cost, how close they came to defeat at critical moments. Japanese officers captured after the war, when questioned about naval battles, invariably mentioned Tassafaronga with pride. For them, it represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval skill, proof that even when outnumbered and outrepresented, superior tactics and training could prevail. Tanaka, who survived the war, was interviewed extensively by American naval historians who wanted to understand how he had achieved such a victory. His answers were revealing not only about naval tactics, but about the Japanese war mindset. Tanaka explained that the Japanese had accepted from the outset that they could never match America in industrial production. Therefore, they had to compensate with quality, training, and innovative tactics. Every Japanese sailor received extensive night training that the Americans simply could not replicate. Japanese torpedo gunners practiced their calculations obsessively until they could estimate distance, speed, and angle instantly, even in total darkness. Japanese commanders constantly studied tactics, conducted war games, debated approaches, and refined their techniques. This emphasis on quality over quantity worked brilliantly at Tassafaronga, but it was fundamentally unsustainable. Every highly trained sailor who died was irreplaceable. Every ship sunk was a loss that Japan could not replace. America could absorb defeats like Tassafaronga, learn from them, and come back stronger with more ships, more men, and better tactics. Japan could not. Every tactical victory consumed precious resources that would never be recovered. At the end of 1942, when Tassafaronga occurred, this reality was not yet fully apparent. Japan was still winning battles, still inflicting disproportionate damage, still demonstrating tactical superiority. But the seeds of defeat had already been planted. American shipyards were producing ships in numbers that defied imagination. Training programs were being revamped based on lessons learned. The American industrial machine was fully mobilized. Tassafaronga was the last great Japanese tactical triumph in the Guadalcanal campaign. After that night, the balance would inexorably tip to the American side, not because the Americans had suddenly become better sailors, but because they had learned, adapted, and brought overwhelming resources to bear. The tactics that worked for Tanaka at Tassafaronga would be studied, countered, and neutralized. The long-lance torpedoes remained lethal, but the Americans had learned to respect them, to maneuver differently, and not to present such tempting targets. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February 1943 was conducted with remarkable skill, using many of the same tactics Tanaka had employed. But it was an evacuation, a retreat, a tacit acknowledgement of strategic defeat. The Japanese troops who were rescued were starving, sick, and defeated. The island they had fought so desperately to hold was now firmly in American hands, transformed into a massive base for future operations. The men who died at Tassafaronga never saw that final victory. They lie at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, their bodies long since consumed by the sea, their names etched on memorials that few visit. The families who received those letters in December of 1942 had to find meaning in deaths that seemed senseless, in a defeat that was quickly overshadowed by subsequent victories. There is a particular cruelty in dying in a battle that is forgotten. Dying at Pearl Harbor, dying at Midway, dying at Iwo Jima, these deaths are remembered, honored, integrated into the national narrative. But dying at Tassafaronga is dying in a footnote, in a paragraph in a history book that most people will never read. It is dying in a defeat that your nation prefers not to discuss. The veterans of Tassafaronga formed associations after the war, maintained contact, and held annual meetings. Not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. They needed to be with people who understood, who had been there, who carried the same memories and the same nightmares. At their meetings, they told stories their families didn't want to hear, jokes that only made sense to those who had faced death on that specific night in that specific place. As they grew older, these gatherings became smaller, the familiar faces disappearing year after year. The younger ones were replaced by empty chairs, by names read in silence, by brief moments of reflection on companions who had finally succumbed to the wounds they had carried for decades, even if they weren't physical. The last meeting of the Tassafaronga survivors was held in the early 2000s, just a handful of very old men sitting together, remembering a night in 1942 when they were young and the world was on fire. Naval academics study Tassafaronga extensively. It's a classic case in war schools, a perfect example of how not to conduct night battles, but also of how innovative tactics and superior weapons can overcome numerical advantage. Modern naval officers analyze every decision, every maneuver, every second of that battle, extracting lessons that inform contemporary doctrine. But these are clinical analyses, diagrams on whiteboards, ship movements on maps, disconnected from the terror and chaos of reality. The true lesson of Tassafaronga is not tactical or technological. It is about the nature of war itself, about how victory and defeat are often determined by minor factors, hesitations of seconds, decisions made with incomplete information, the blind chance of a torpedo hitting or missing. It is about how nations at war construct narratives that serve psychological needs, emphasizing victories and minimizing defeats, creating clean and heroic stories of conflicts that were dirty and brutal. It's about how the price of war is always paid by individuals, by 19-year-old sailors who never returned home, by destroyed families, by survivors who carried scars for the rest of their lives. And it's about how societies deal with that cost, about which deaths are remembered and which are forgotten, about which battles are taught in schools and which are omitted from history books. Iron Bottom Sound still holds its secrets. The wreckage lies there, at the bottom, slow corrosion turning steel to rust, creating artificial reefs where fish swim through corridors that once echoed with the footsteps of men. Divers occasionally explore this wreckage, touching metal heated to red hot by explosions, swimming through spaces where men died. But even they cannot truly comprehend what happened there, cannot feel the terror, cannot hear the screams, cannot know the names of all those who remained when the ship sank. Tassafaronga is a tragedy that few Americans talk about because it challenges the comfortable narrative of steady progress toward victory. It is a reminder that World War II was not an inevitable triumphal march, but a desperate struggle where victory was never guaranteed, where mistakes cost lives, where the enemy was competent and dangerous, where Americans died not only heroically but sometimes needlessly, victims of tactical failures and inadequate preparation. And that is precisely why it must be remembered, taught, discussed. Because honoring the dead doesn't just mean celebrating victories, but acknowledging all the lives lost, all the battles fought, all the defeats suffered. It means understanding that war is horror, even when necessary, even when just, even when won. It means recognizing that the men who served and died deserve to be remembered not as pieces in some triumphant national narrative, but as individuals who paid the ultimate price at a time when their nation needed them most. November 30th, 1942, was just another night in World War II, one among thousands of nights of combat spread over 6 years and across the globe. But for the men who were there, for the families who lost loved ones, for the survivors who carried memories, it was everything. It was the night the world exploded in fire and steel. The night comrades disappeared. The night death passed so close they could feel it. They deserve more than oblivion. They deserve their story to be told, completely, honestly, without sanitization or omission. Because that is the only way to truly honor them, to truly learn from their sacrifice, to truly understand what was asked and given in that terrible moment in human history.